Hey guys, welcome to the podcast. My guest today is Alysia Bullock. She's the founder of InciteHR, and we talk about change management and what pharma leaders should do to handle bad news and setbacks. So, really important topic right now. Timing wise, big announcement. Don't forget to sign up for Mass West, which is coming up September 25th and 26th, and that's in San Diego, California. It's the Medical Affairs Strategic Summit by Fierce Life Sciences. It's a great medical affairs event with networking, amazing content. You don't want to miss it. Mass East was epic. It was one of the best ones I've ever been to. So sign up, just go to Google and type in Mass West 2024 and the registration information will be in there. So I look forward to seeing you in San Diego. Hey guys, welcome to the MSL Talk podcast, a show specifically designed for MSLs and all things field medical. If you get value from these episodes, please click the subscribe button and share this with others. Tell all your friends. Thank you for all your support. Hey, Alicia, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Hey, Tom, great to see you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, hey guys, so Alicia and I know each other for a long time. I mean, we go back, sheesh, I don't
20
even want to
years.
say how long, but it's a long time. I'm dating both of us by saying it, but so Alicia is someone that I know from the HR side of the equation. And she's brilliant and has like really amazing like insights and knowledge and depth of experience. So we're going to talk about a very, very important and relevant and current topic. But before we get into it, Alicia, why don't you do a quick introduction?
Sure. Thanks, Tom. So, yes, 20 years. So, if I've just dated us, I'm sorry about that.
Man.
A little bit about me. So, I have spent 25 years in HR, predominantly as an HR business partner. Most of those years have been with pharmaceutical companies and supporting clients across the globe from R&D, commercial, supply chain. And I think relevant to the topic today, Tom, I think, as part of my role as a business partner is really helping leaders and organizations navigate that change, everything from communications to strategy to implementation to sometimes the unfortunate side of impacts and helping companies and employees really be resilient as the aftermath and re-engage them post-change.
Yep.
More currently is, from my own consulting firm, which I started about 2 years ago, I think still operating in that space and providing leadership coaching and team development, to teams and to leaders, in that same respect, as they continue to go through their own transitions personally and professionally.
Cool. Awesome. Well, I'm excited. And yeah, so we're going to talk about change management. And for those of you who aren't totally familiar with that topic, it's really kind of an HR title or topic. And we're going to talk about it as it relates to the pharmaceutical industry and the volatility and what happens when companies get bad news and how internally there are ways of handling that change in order to maintain the culture. So I don't want to get too far ahead, but can we start with Alicia, what that topic or that title, change management? Can you describe what that is, what it refers to?
Sure. So I think when we hear the term change management, it feels like this really ominous term. And I think very simply, change management is how we manage change. I think it's the process of planning for a change, executing a change, and then reinforcing the change. And I think that the thoughtfulness that goes into each one of those phases, right? So when you think about planning the change, who do we need to involve? What is the strategy behind it? So really that why. Why are we making this change? What's the rationale of the business? And then that second phase around managing the change, right? And that's where I think a lot of times when people think of change management, we think about communications. And communications, while a really important part of change management as a whole, is not the only part, right? Because then you have to implement it, and that change might be new structures, processes, systems. And then, after we do the announcement and some of the early integration of change, then there's going to be the reinforcing change. How are we making sure that the change sticks, that we are recognizing, the change that has happened, we are celebrating where employees have come along that change and celebrating this new stage for the future state of the company. So when I think of change management, it's going to be that entire process from planning to implementing, and then I think sustaining it and reinforcing it.
And it's funny, when I think of change management, I almost always think of it as something that happens after an event or a crisis or a news or something that affects the employees of an organization. Um, so can you elaborate on that? Am I correct in saying that? And if so, are there typical events that would influence change management?
Sure. I think you're spot on with everything that you've just said. And I think also particularly in the pharma world, there might be some nuances that are specific to this industry, and that could be regulatory changes, right? A regulatory change that may require organizations to change internal operations, or how we look at compliance. There could be patent expiration. There could be product recalls. How do we manage both the internal change, and how do we manage the relationship, the investor relations? How do we manage messages to customers and patients in those scenarios? There's, I think, more of the general terms of what happens or what triggers a organizational change, and that could be cost optimization. It's an unfortunate, but it's a reality of doing businesses. Businesses need to remain profitable. And as such, organizations may take measures to streamline operations, bring in new technologies to make things more efficient and simpler. Downside of that is there's going to be skill sets that employees have that might not be as relevant, and we need to bring in new sets. So that might cause, a change of talent. I think there's change, I think, that happens at the organization level, but I also wouldn't underestimate the changes that happens in a more local level. Maybe we're going into a new geography. Maybe we are consolidating a footprint in different countries. Maybe it's just a function, and there's been a really tenured leader that's there who may be retiring, right? A change in leadership can also trigger, the sentiment of change management. It might not require as much really big architected or, orchestrated change planning, but I think that there's elements of change that are the emotional side that might not be, again, a big organizational change, but a local change that can trigger, how we care for employees throughout that process.
Okay, so a lot to unpack there, but looking at all of what you just said, all those things, all those organizational changes. So something happens.
Yes.
Okay, and there's an organizational event of some sort. What's the first thing that should happen next?
I think as we define what the event is, there's the communications that I think are the catalyst for the cascade, right? The conversations or the announcements that are made even at the organizational level, down through the department level to the employee level. And even though we see that being I'll call it the triggering event of communication, I think what happens after that, that first wave is going to be that continued conversation. Because we can say why this is happening at a company, why it's great for the company, and what's changing. But, as humans, our natural default position is going to be, well, what about me? How does this change for me? What is my role? And so to get down to that specificity to the individual, it can be nothing's changing for you. It could be your manager's changing, your team's changing, but your role staying the same. It could be as different as we're no longer selling a product. We're no longer operating in a market. Or the opposite end of that spectrum could be your position's being eliminated. And so when I think about communications, we talked about that being sort of that start of that implementation of change is going to be the thoughtfulness of that cascade, where I've seen good change management efforts, Tom, it's been every employee has a touch point. And that could be an email, it can be an individual call, but there is something where we are caring for every employee who is impacted or even not impacted in that change from an awareness perspective. Where I've seen companies maybe go a little bit, outside of that cycle is nothing's changing for that employee, so we don't need to say anything.
Mm.
And in the absence of information, what do? We make stuff up. We make up our stories, or we cobble together rumors just to create something that makes sense for us. So to answer your question, I think post that announcement, there is a very heavy lift, I think, on communications, the repetition, and I think creating multiple touch points, meaning the more we hear it, the more we ask questions and answer questions for employees, is going to be the start of how do we help them get their head around what is changing in various degrees.
Yeah, and that's so important what you're saying. I feel like if if there's no communication or a lack of a communication, or if employees aren't informed
Mm-hmm.
with something, they're going to think the worst. So
Absolutely.
an idle mind is a devil's workshop, right? So if an employee, if an event happens, news or an announcement, and an employee is uninformed, and it's like, oh, nothing to see here, business as usual, because you hear that. Oh yeah, it's just business as usual. And it's like, yeah, I don't know about that because I just heard this. And then what happens is they think the worst, and they think of their friend or friends that were in a similar situation and they lost their job or whatever. So I totally agree with the importance of it. I think it's a total mistake to under communicate. But as I'm thinking about this, what are the mistakes? You've been doing this a long time. Like, what are the common mistakes that companies make when it relates to this whole, you know, change management and event and organizational event management type of process?
Sure. So I think we touched on a big one, which is lack of communication. Some of the other mistakes that I see are going to be ignoring feedback.
Mm.
We communicate to employee base and we go, great, they get it, they understood, business as usual, let's move on. And what we've done is assumed that people are on board, or assume that if they don't like the change, that they're not on board. And what we haven't done in that process, we've allowed the employee to emotionally process the change, which is part of them getting on board, right? So when we say ignoring feedback, how do leaders create channels by which employees are saying, wow, this stinks, or I'm not quite sure I understand, or how will I be successful? This might not change for me, but I'm really feeling disconnected because I just lost the manager that I used to work for who brought me into the organization. Or, wow, this person sat on my floor and I saw them every day. And now that office space is going to be vacant. Right. And so creating those channels by which employees can share, can be heard. I think also is if we ignore the feedback from employees, that feedback that employees are giving us can help inform what might be the messages that we missed, that we didn't think of. What might be a common concern that we say, you know what, we do have a resource for that. Or if we don't, we need to build it. So with that cycle of feedback is also helpful. I think if we ignore that, we're not giving the opportunities to process through their change. I think another important element as well is having navigated some of these change plans within organizations, we do a really nice job of preparing leaders for the event of communication. But what we don't do is, and where I think we could do better, is helping employees understand that emotional cycle. Just because an employee is not bought in on day one or expresses frustration or confusion, let's not write them off, right? But we have to help managers understand how to help employees through their own emotional curve, right? And I think that's a skill that's not developed necessarily in the moment of the change plan, right? That's a skill that I think will serve leaders and people managers before the change, during the change, and after the change. I think another mistake that is also very common, right? We talk about change is constant, right? How many times have we said that or reiterated that phrase? And then we look at the landscape now. You know, change is becoming faster and faster, right? More changes are layered on. Is understanding where the organization right now stands in terms of change fatigue, right? If this change is now happening on the heels of another big change in the organization, where's the emotional and mental capacity of these employees to absorb yet another change? or is this apathy or this exhaustion that exists? And so I think having a good pulse on what your culture is before the change will help inform the pace at which you introduce a new change. What are the messages that tie together so it doesn't feel like, oh, and something else, like it's death by 1,000 cuts, right? And so I think making sure that there's a cohesive picture. Is there a really strong vision? Is there a strategy? And I think if we don't connect those messages, it can feel like, oh, and another thing. And then there's that cycle of we're waiting for that other shoe to drop.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's really valuable. The question now I'm thinking, who's responsible for doing the heavy lifting? How do things get implemented? How does change management actually get implemented?
Sure. I would say very much as a shared responsibility. I don't think it's a responsibility of a single party. And your senior leadership, right? Whoever is at the top levels of leadership where this change is going to be impacted, they have that responsibility to understand and design what the strategy is, and how does this change help support either department functionality, organizational strategy, or future state vision. I think from there, it's understanding, who those stakeholders are, right? So within that senior leadership, who are going to be those key players that are going to play the face of that. I think your middle management, right? Your directors, your first line people managers have the responsibility to understand what's expected from them in terms of what are the messages that I need to tell my team. They are going to be those front lines of executing the change and being the first point of contact from the employees who are going to be responsible for helping implement that change. So your middle managers and your directors, they're probably going to get the tidal wave of emotion from the majority of your employee base. So they have the responsibility to not only understand the change, get themselves through it, but also be on the front lines to help further the communication. Some other key roles that are in the organization, your HR leaders, if you bring in specialists for change, your communications lead, they're all going to be important stakeholders to help, again, design. What are we saying? How are we saying it? How are we supporting employees? How are we getting a pulse on engagement throughout this process? Are we saying the right messages internally and externally? And I think your biggest population that also has a responsibility in this time is going to be your employees. If there's a change that's happening to me or my role in my organization, I have the responsibility to listen to the communications, read the emails, ask questions, get that clarity, share how I'm feeling, check my own emotions through this as well. How am I feeling, and where do I do a little bit of self-management, but then also, step into a proactive role to what do I need to understand and what do I need support for to accept this change? Now, with that, though, I think the assumption that 100% of employees are going to get on board is really optimistic. And we'd love to say that that was the case. But there are going to be employees, I think, who go through their own change curves and may take longer or may not come around at all. But I think overall is every group that I just mentioned plays an important role, right? If there's no direction, if there's no strategy, if there's no communication and there's no employee ownership in that, there's going to be some fail points in your change plan. So I think the responsibility is shared over everyone.
Well, I think this is so critical because one of the byproducts that I see from events and announcements is the toxic culture that could eventually develop and grow if it's not handled properly and if it's not handled quickly. I just see it. And once it happens, and as a recruiter, we get the phone calls from the employees from these companies, and we hear about how things have been handled, and we learn about the toxicity that now exists. So how would a company, after handling an event, be able to prevent that toxic culture from even happening?
What I would start with is if an organization already has a toxic culture, any change management is going to be an uphill battle, right? If the culture is already one where there is lack of trust, lack of transparency, divisiveness, in the culture itself, change management is going to be really hard, because now we're saying, hey, you didn't trust me before, but we're going to implement this change and it's going to be great for this organization, and we need you to get along and trust me. And that's a really hard sell. I think to prevent or to minimize any toxicity on the other side is, I've seen change management, and I think in some of the cases that we're talking about that are really prevalent in the media today, which is organizations making the decision to lay off. So I'll speak from that angle, if I may. And that is, when an organization makes the decision to cut jobs, right? People are impacted, jobs are impacted. There's the initial resentment. Why me? How did you choose? And then there's this other concept, which is your survivor syndrome, right? I'm a layoff survivor. And that comes with another bag of emotions that are not always positive, right? How did they pick me, right? There may be some shaking confidence in there. There might be when is the other shoe drop that I was speaking about before, or gosh, I feel really guilty because I got to stay and they didn't. And all of those emotions can cause a sort of undercurrent of negativity, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's toxic, right? I think it's allowing those emotions to process. Change management sometimes is so much, let's plan and let's execute. And if anybody has an emotion, they're not on board. And that's not true. We are humans. We are complex. We will have emotions, and negativity does not equate to toxicity. And how do we prevent that? And I think we prevent that by, one, listening. What are people's concerns? Helping those employees know that, listen, we care. And that doesn't come of, we care now. We didn't care before, but now that we've changed, we care now. So it speaks to what is the culture that you're building in advance of a change. And I've seen reductions in force go really, really well. And having worked at a company where, from an HR perspective, we made sure that communications were clear, employees got information timely, we provided supporting resources. So whether that is outplacement services, whether that be resume support writing, whether that be job fairs, whether that be we're really tapping into our referral networks to help employees. I think when employees are vulnerable, whether they've been impacted or not, our ability as leaders to just be human can go a really long way. And may not change the decision. The decision was made for a position elimination. How we treat another person can go miles, in how they experience that. Again, they're not going to like the decision, but how we treat somebody in those moments does a couple things. I think, one, it helps the reputation of that organization and that impact in employees' eyes to go, wow, they had to make a business decision, but I really value how they treated me, even though if I didn't like the decision. The other side of the organization, your retained organization that's staying, right? That survivor group. They're looking at how the organization is treating employees who are leaving, right? And that creates the perception of, well, my company, they had to make a tough decision, but they really treated those employees with dignity, with respect, with a heavy degree of support. And that leaves a lasting impression. Tom, one of my most memorable moments in my career was when an employee in my client group came to me and said, wow, that was a really tough decision, but I will never forget how kind you were, how empathetic you were, and the support you put around me during this really tough time. And that comment is 20 years dated, but it will stay with me through my career. And I think where employees and organizations can get this wrong, if I'm at liberty to say that, is thinking that once we communicate, we shift people off, we get the retained organization to keep going, and we'll all forget about it because it's in the rear view and full steam ahead, and we're going to forget about it. And if you didn't have a toxic culture to start with, how you treat employees through these really tough times could either create a toxic culture that you didn't anticipate because you didn't give credit to treating people with dignity and respect through these changes.
I think that's so important. I think that just what you said about just treating people with respect and dignity and understand the human element that's involved in these difficult times. And that's why HR is called human resources, because you guys are resources for that human element. And the way you treat people, especially during the difficult times, is what ultimately resonates with them. And that's how a culture is won or lost. It's the reputation of an organization. How do you treat people? How do you make them feel? And how do you support them? You talked about resources, and so if there is a layoff, what resources are you going to make available to them? Little shameless plug, don't forget to order my book, Job Search Mastery: How to Win Your Dream Job, if you find yourself in that situation. Kidding,
like
but
it.
serious. My book's helping a lot of people, but the idea is for organizations, I really think, to make sure that it's not just an announcement and okay, everybody's going to be fine, business as usual, nothing to see here. But let's talk about, we haven't really talked about the employee side of
Mhm.
the equation. Let's flip it to the employee. What advice do you have on how employees should be handling changes and news that they may get as they're cruising along in their normal career, in the normal day?
Sure. So employees play a really active role. And this isn't just in regards to organizational change, but I think this is applicable to personal change as well. So I hope what I'm about to share is helpful in both regards. And that is, there's something that happens, right? There is either a message from an organization, news from there could be media, right? That we read that triggers some sort of emotion. And I think for employees first to recognize what is that emotion and where is it coming from, and all of us are going to have perception in terms of, well, this emotion is bad, right? And we react on that versus there's going to be this emotion, but there has to be this pause that I think is so important to say, what do I know and what do I don't know? What do I need to know and where do I get it from? Right. And I think employees playing a really accurate role in informing themselves so they can make a decision that's best for them. And I loved your phrase earlier, where in the absence of information, we make up stories. And how do those stories get made up? We we hear from friends and family or former colleagues that had a really bad experience in a layoff, or we go down the rabbit hole, in news and media outlets about, what's the worst that could happen, right? You open up any media outlet, it's going to lend itself to more negative news, right? And that's all the things that feed us when we have this emotion. Chicken Little, the sky is falling, right? Versus as an employee, again, what do I need to know and where do I get it from? Gather data, ask questions, get clarity, and truly figure out what this means for me. I think as change is done well, there's elements of change well beyond the communication that talk about rebuilding that organization, right? If I'm an employee, what are the skills that I'm going to need to have differently? How will I be successful? How will the organization support me in being successful? And I think as you build in that information, you go from a point of lack of understanding, a lack of awareness, to informed consciousness, right? I now know what's ahead of me. I now know what to navigate. I now know what I need. But in that time, I think there's also this choice. And in that choice, I, as an employee, to say, yes, I subscribe to this change and I'm all in. And I'm going to keep myself informed, engaged, proactive, and I'm going to commit to this change. And there might be hopefully a small camp of employees that say, this isn't aligned to what I want to do. And this is no longer the right environment for me. And they may opt out. But I think as an employee, recognize that you preserve that choice, to go along with the change and inform yourself or to opt out. But my advice to employees is to say, act on information, not just emotion.
Good tip. Good advice. And you mentioned, so we talk about terms. You had mentioned a term to me. You said, use the term organizational energy. So can you talk about that and describe what that is?
Sure. When I use the term organizational energy, I equate it to almost a current. right? A tide almost, right? The momentum in, say, the ocean, right? You've got tides coming in and out. There's that similarity of that current that exists in an organization. What contributes to that? It can be either, a lot of that is going to be your culture, right? How decisions are made, how information is communicated is going to create this current in terms of how organizations evolve, thrive, or not thrive, right? If the current in an organization is one based on trust, transparency, resilience, adaptability, right? All of those tenets are built in before the change. That current is going to help accelerate that change, right? It's going to be working in that same direction. Differently is if you're facing headwinds, right? If you're facing, we've already done a ton of change in the organization, there's not trust. Maybe the organization is not in a really good financial position, right? Maybe there's going to be, some of the other challenges we talked about that are prevalent in the pharma industry around, products and regulatory. If all of those are headwinds in the organization, you may not have that same internal current that's going to carry that change program and make it harder. Like I said, they're going to end up showing up as either resistance or lack of engagement or retention issues. So that organizational energy I speak to is going to be that current, I think, can actually work in favor of a change, or it can, help them, or it can impede a change and make it more challenging than an organization has a really positive culture.
Well, I hope that this information will bring positive organizational energy and the right emotion to the organizations and people that are listening to this, because we've seen so much of the alternative where we see the volatility of what's happening even currently right now, the layoffs and announcements and everything else, just kind of have a very negative energy. And I used the word toxic before. I think that's like this word that gets attached to culture sometimes. So I hope this information was helpful. Alicia, thank you. You were awesome. Thanks for joining me here.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I think the role that HRs and leaders can play is so much about that pre-planning. However, if I were to leave, you and the listeners with anything, Tom, it would be is going back to, treat people like people. We've all experienced personally and professionally, some unfortunate, or unfavorable news, and we have a choice in how we respond to that. But I think equally organizations have, that responsibility. I think one, for their own reputation, but also for the success of their business in the future is, investing in helping employees be successful wherever they land on that side of the change. So thank you. This is a great conversation.
It was awesome. And thank you again. And guys, thank you for joining me, and thank you for making this one of the fastest growing podcasts in the pharma world. And if you got value out of this, please share it with others. And as always, thank you for your support. We'll see you next time.